This afternoon we have Jonas Rugies, who's with Westchester University, and he will be talking about defining U.S. megaregions. So here you go. It's all yours, Jonas.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's get my clicker here. So I'm Jonas Rugies. I'm a master's student at Westchester University, part of the Department of Geography and Planning. Similar to a few of the previous speakers, I left a really good job to go back to school, and it's been an incredibly rewarding experience so far. So wanted to share a little bit about my research topic. Obviously, it's GIS Day, so I'm going to focus on the GIS methodology, but also coming from a department of geographers and planners, highlight some of the different ways that the two disciplines can, from my perspective, work better together. So start with a quick question. Who is coming physically from one of the counties symbolized on the map in red? Anyone? All right. Pretty good. How about now? And this includes Harrisburg, if you can't see. Okay. And then finally, these counties. And notice that this one does not include Harrisburg or the county we're in. All right. Interesting. Gives me a good sense of who's here, but also the fact that regions can be very difficult to define, or they can be subjective, right? We're a lot of people skilled in geography and GIS at a Central PA GIS Day, but the boundaries of Central PA can change based on what the purpose of the event is, what the incentive is. So that's just a quick example of some of the problems we run into as geographers in terms of defining regions. And in my review of the literature, it seems like many contemporary geographers bypass the issue altogether because of how problematic and subjective it can be. One great example is the Wikipedia page of the different regions of Pennsylvania. You can see that many of them are based on county boundaries, kind of subjective. Notice where I'm coming from, Chester County falls in a number of them that are a little bit questionable, or, for example, Center County, defining the Happy Valley region in Pennsylvania. It's not altogether useful. I really wouldn't point anyone to this as authoritative information. Regions can play very important roles in communication and in getting multiple groups of stakeholders together to back initiatives. So this map comes from the 10-year strategic plan document coming from the state of Pennsylvania, kind of the prospectus for that 10-year strategic economic investment plan. Highlights some good things. We've got 3 international ports. Didn't recognize that Pittsburgh was being on the Ohio River, a port. But there's a lot of economic development activity going on in the state. And one of the things I wanted to do in my research was connect this initiative in the Commonwealth. We want to promote these 5 strategic industries with the work that we do as geographers and planners to better communicate, A, why Pennsylvania is a competitive location for all the different companies looking to invest here, even countries in some examples, but also what are the actual connections between these investments and where do those decision points lie? So I'm not going to go through all of this, but want to point out that part of the plan is building these vibrant and resilient regions and defining those regions and providing good methodologies that can be repeatable by other researchers, other professionals, to essentially perform the same exact regional definitions that were used in a previous study or in something that they're looking to connect to. So I spent some time reviewing the press releases on the state site, taking a look at these different industries and what's being announced and seeing how far could I get to creating essentially opportunity zones or economic regions that align with these different strategic industries, with the goal of getting down to that level of detail that you see, for example, in the Keystone Opportunity Map, where specific parcels are highlighted with tax and investment incentives. That's really, in my mind, the idea that we can get to, or at least work with students to get as far as possible into those situations. So Just some diagrams here in terms of the strategic choices that businesses and companies are making in terms of where to locate, and then an idea of competitive analysis. We're also part of a business school in Westchester, so definitely want to highlight that business strategy perspective when talking about defining regions like this. So right now, I think, and please let me know if there are resources that I've overlooked, but we've got a map, we've got a document, we've got a series of press releases in terms of business coming to the state. Great examples, GlaxoSmithKline, just a week ago, announced another major investment in the state of Pennsylvania. There's lots of great press releases. And I've tried to organize the icons on the map kind of where I thought these regions are going to develop. But this is very much a work in progress, but I want to make the point that it can be very important to use a map to communicate, especially when people are making decisions about areas they might not be completely familiar with. But that might not have anything to do with you and your personal life. So I wanted to connect what I'm doing to the decisions I make in life and I think everyone else faces at some point, right? Where are you going to live? Where are you going to make your investments? And how do you minimize risk? So many of these presentations and talks have been focused on risks and hazards. So, for example, myself, I had the opportunity to look at the entire United States and determine where was I going to end up. And this map, published in 2008 by the Regional Plan Association, actually had a huge impact on my decision-making process. Now, I might be the only person who actually made a major life decision based on a simple map like this, but something about the way the Front Range was represented really caught my imagination. Coming from northern New Jersey, I saw this and I connected the dots in my youthful mind that there's a whole urban megaregion right there in the Rocky Mountains, just like it is here on the East Coast. So flew out to Denver, thought that I could live in Denver without owning a car. Very quickly realized that that was not the case and that the nature of the place was just different. To me, it felt suburban. Even if I was in the middle of the city, I felt like I was in the suburbs. And I knew something was fundamentally different about these places, something I couldn't describe yet. But I knew that something about this map was not entirely representative of reality. And it stuck in my head. It made me think. I would mention it every now and then to my colleagues at Esri when we were on a trip or something like, hey, there was this map I saw and it really stuck in my mind. And then it kind of came back to me when I was working at school in my studies, trying to get a handle on, well, how do you understand and communicate such a complex reality in different contexts? And one of the things that I realized was it's bigger than just one area. In geography, we usually define the grain and the extent of our study. And that map that you just saw, I'll flip back to it, the reason that this organization, the Regional Plan Association, they're located in New York, they're responsible for regional planning in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut region. I say responsible, they're a nonprofit planning organization, quasi-official, not really associated with the government, but they produce a lot of plans. Their impetus for creating this was global megaregional competition, and they say right at the beginning of the prospectus, other regions in the world are planning at this urban megaregional scale, and the United States needs to start planning at this urban megaregional scale if we are to compete in the world economy. That was the premise in 2009. And if we look today at Europe and Asia and South Asia on the map, probably need to include a Middle East urban megaregion map at this point, we can see that we can look at the world not as political boundaries, but at these contiguous urbanized zones. And in the EU, and obviously in China, central long-term planning at these vast geographic scales are occurring. And there are multiple interpretations of what that means in terms of taking action, but this is where this starting point is coming from the Regional Plan Association and their reason for why this is important. And that national competitive advantage at the country scale is very similar to the state competitive advantage that the governor talks about at the state scale. So getting into the methodology, this is where I spent the majority of my time in the research paper. Moving into a thesis, which is more focused on the literature, is taking a look at how were these regions derived. And this is where I noticed kind of an important distinction between planners and geographers, where a paper was published in 2009 that provides a quantitative methodology for defining urban megaregions based on these 5 variables. And it's part of a core-based statistical area, high population density, and some projected population and employment rates forward to 2025. Remember, they're using year 2000 census data saying, here's what we anticipate to happen. And it was actually branded as America 2050, but we're here in 2025 and we can rerun this methodology and see, were the predictions on point, or did things deviate significantly from the information that was being represented? And there's another important point I want to make here about the methodology, where even though a quantitative methodology was provided, the final map is more informed by a qualitative methodology, where the planners at the RPA essentially drew lines around the regions with the qualitative results as their starting point. But what we end up with is very different from our qualitative starting point. And it makes it very difficult to recreate something like that, because we can't just run updated data. It really depends on the consensus that was reached by the particular qualitative method. So what I want to do is move more towards the quantitative, reproducible style of publishing research, where anyone can take that information, look at the data, look at the method, and rerun it on updated data and get the exact same result, and then they could talk about a comparison. So just that methodology, now that we have such great GIS tools and clearinghouses and inventories available, it's not too hard to go the full way and publish something that someone can take and quickly reproduce. So that's exactly what I did. I took these 5 variables, I applied them to 2024 estimated data coming from Esri. So this is 2020 census data that then the Esri demographics team takes, makes, as far as I could tell, a good estimate for 2024. That's where I ran this data, and these are the results that I got. So we'll look into this a little bit more, but right off the bat, I noticed that the urban areas, those counties that have a score of 5 or 4, were more concentrated than I'd expected them to be. But also I noticed a problem with the methodology in that established urban zones were receiving lower scores, because much of this was based on growth of the region. So you can see areas like Florida, like Texas, like the Pacific Northwest, very bright yellow. Same thing with Atlanta. But if you look into New Jersey, Long Island, Connecticut, not a lot of yellow, even though these are some of the most urbanized and developed places in the country. So the next step was comparing what I got with what the RPA had published in 2009. And that was a little bit difficult because I did not have access to the complete table list for the counties. So I had to visually recreate their index county by county from a blurry PDF document. I'd reached out to the author and the organization, couldn't get the FIPS codes aligned with the index scores, so we're missing the smallest geographical units in the map, and we're also missing Connecticut because Connecticut switched from 8 counties to 9 planning regions sometime in between these census runs. So year 2000, Connecticut's got 8 counties, 2010, 2020, Connecticut's got 9 planning regions. We had to harmonize that in order to do a one-to-one comparison. So if we now compare the 2 runs of that score, what we can see is, and obviously I have tables and things describing this in greater detail, but to summarize, the employment and population growth in the United States from 2000 to 2024 was more concentrated than anticipated, and overall it was lower than what was anticipated. So the population did not grow as fast, and the growth was far more concentrated. All of these counties in that light red for the -1 means that some form of growth in population and employment was expected in all of these. And that is really not the pattern that we're seeing at all. So what I wanted to do was create a methodology that more accurately represented what I had experienced traveling around the country and doing research and understanding, okay, what are the true top-tier urban megaregions in the United States? And I drew kind of the definition from that from a paper by Robert Lang, Don Duvall, that's the Lincoln Land Institute, that I also collaborate with the RPA. But I said, okay, if I add these counties together, they have to be contiguous, more than 10,000 people, and generally share these characteristics that you can see here on the screen. And I incorporated 2 new variables because my advisor had said, you can't use these 5 demographic variables. You've got to incorporate more from other research. So one of the big ones is, and it gets us a raster layer to work with, the Earth at night black marble imagery from NASA. And then a data set I created myself of all the 500 S&P 500 corporate headquarters locations. And this is a data set that I'd been building to help with my own investments and work at the business school. But I noticed they were highly clustered in these same exact areas and provided a useful temporary substitute for me to indicate economic importance, global economic competitiveness in a particular region. There are more advanced methods that I will hopefully incorporate, but for now I'm using this 500-point layer because, if you can see here in the updated index creation, there's only 152 counties that have any S&P 500 company locations in the entire country. So they're highly concentrated. It tells us something about economic hubs and clusters and industry specification. If you think about the Commonwealth strategic plan, is exactly what we're trying to foster here in the state. So here's my updated index. I gave a weight of 2 to the S&P 500 companies in the county locations and a weight of 3 to the light pollution area layer, 100 square kilometers or larger, largely just through a subjective process of looking at the map, looking at the city, most often somewhere that I've been and was familiar with, and saying, okay, let's call it right there, calculate the index because this is a starting point. This is something that I intend to iterate on for the next 25 years every time we get updated data. But these are the core of the inputs. I don't anticipate this changing a whole lot. And the results I got from this index really indicated to a closer extent what I expected as a result, and also what I had experienced just moving around the country. I've been very privileged to work with all kinds of different utilities, infrastructure organizations, governments. You really get to hear from the people who live in the places what's going on, what the challenges are, what their problems are, and you get to visit it and kind of form that image of the real world in your mind. And I have that, and I'm able to compare the results I get from the GIS analysis, and it was a pretty exciting moment seeing, well, each one of these counties that I noticed things growing, things happening, kind of landed there in the index score as I saw. So this is what I'm working with right now. I had mentioned that there's those 4 urban megaregions that I defined, and there's still problems, but I think it's more important to highlight the problems. Like I can see some expressions like why are those counties missing? What? Well, because it's simply a quantitative methodology that was used to define this. So we can see here we are in Harrisburg, right at the edge of the defined Northeast megaregion. The green lines are highway traffic volumes. So you can see the Northeast corridor. And these are kind of the cartographic elements that I want to keep and focus on when creating any kind of map or anything having to do with these urban megaregions. A lot of the symbology I got from those initial RPA maps and the methodology. But these are really the heavy hitters in terms of the country. Obviously, the Northeast is kind of, in a way, the original megaregion. Want to highlight that this body of work that the Regional Plan Association came up with really relied on a foundation in geography. I think it was 1969 book, Megalopolis, by a French geographer, Jean Gutmann, who was it was the 20th Century Fund that sponsored his research And he produced an 800-page geographic work of kind of the old French geography regional description style, very rich, very data-heavy, but it became an authoritative cornerstone for policy to be built on top of. So time and again in the Regional Plan Association literature, we see this used as an example. Here we have the Megalopolis book, and then on top of that, we've got Senator Claiborne Pell, who 6 years later wrote Megalopolis Unbound and advocated for the creation of what became the Amtrak system. Passenger rail, funded and planned for at a larger scale, already bringing in champions from industry. And I think that's the real point that many people keep pointing to is authoritative geographic work, the work of planners and politicians and everyone on the same page, and then ideally, policy, laws passed, programs funded, et cetera. So it really all started here in the Northeast, but as you can see, we've got 3 others. Florida, the growth in Florida has really been extraordinary, in the 40% for both population density, and jobs. So I think we're really at peak Florida right now. Southern California, obviously, very important industry hub for a lot of things, very important port, but contiguous, heavily urbanized, and then finally Northern California as the 4th megaregion, just above that 2024 10,000 or 10 million population cutoff. So I was fortunate that I chose that as the number because you really can't ignore Northern California when you're talking about urban megaregions in the US. It's the center of technology. It's one of the most important places, even though population and employment numbers aren't the highest. The value and impact of many of those companies, many of the things going on in the Bay Area have obviously global significance. So that was not the most interesting thing I found because this is common sense. Everyone knows that these are established, important urban areas that really are defining how we live today. But what's really interesting to me are all those other areas on the map that did not qualify. The questions that come to mind are they growing? Will they follow the trend, as Gottman predicted, of becoming these urban megaregions? Or is the population decline and employment decline that we're seeing really changing the game and changing the expectations where this entire linear trend of growth is going to plateau and decline, where so many of the assumptions need to be revisited for planners, policymakers, et cetera. So what I did was develop kind of a cartographic standard to look at the counties that received that score to be included in an urban megaregion, but did not have the contiguous sum total population of exceeding 10 million. That's what we see in the black here. We've got the urban areas, we've got the interstate highways with their traffic flows, but then I defined these gap and growth counties based on their index score and proximity to an established urban area. So if you border an urban area, but you're a rural county with 0 growth, you're symbolized on red as red in the map, but not 0 growth, 10, 15%. The high growth counties, the ones that have a high index score but did not quite make it into the megaregion, are symbolized in green. And then counties that were in that middle range are not symbolized at all. But I chose the Front Range to start with because this is an area I'm extremely familiar with, having lived in Colorado for 7 years. I was up in Fort Collins for 3 years, then I moved down to Broomfield and Denver, and this accurately represented my mental map of the region and its growth. The Denver urban corridor is constrained by the plains out east. You know, you go far out east enough, there's really not a lot going on. And then in the mountains, you're geographically constrained. You can see some of the mountain towns and the ski traffic, but there's major constraints there for population and employment growth. The direction of the growth is northward. And you can see that pattern of I-25, the amount of traffic that I know very well going up to Fort Collins, Greeley, Loveland, all the way, almost toward the Wyoming border, not quite there. Massive development along I-25. So beginning to review what I found as a result of the GIS-based methodology really started to get me thinking about, okay, this is a way to approach planning, economic development, and understanding at this scale. So I wanted to share just a couple highlights of this from those megaregions that were identified in the RPA map, because this one in particular surprised me. It's referred to as the Texas Triangle, but that county in between Waco and Dallas, Hill County, Texas, zero growth, because Dallas is growing northward and the Waco area is growing southward. And there's really just not enough impetus, or I haven't looked into it too far, but just there's a gap there that no data tells us is going to be filled. There's no assumption we can make. There would need to be a real policy effort to complete that urban corridor, but then again, what's the value of completing an urban corridor? It raises some very interesting questions. But even though Texas has grown incredibly fast, and so many companies moved to Dallas and all the rest, referring to it as a contiguous region like the one we're used to, Boston to DC, it's not accurate. It doesn't represent the actual surface of the earth or the human behaviors that we see on it. Really just two growth counties to speak of, and you can kind of see the direction that urban areas move. Another somewhat surprising one was Cascadia. We've got two distinct urban zones in Washington and Oregon. We've got Seattle-Tacoma, and we can connect that to Vancouver, and we've got the Willamette Valley in Portland. The counties in between are not urbanizing, not growing, and again, not necessarily a problem either. It's all depending on where are the incentives, who wants to see what and where, and what works out for the majority of people. But we can see Spokane, but then it's really not coming together. The growth is happening in concentrated ways. Now, the Great Lakes was particularly interesting to me because it's one of the original historical megaregions. It's one that's lost a significant amount of population over the past, especially 100 years, 50 years, but even in the past 25 years, there's some counties that are not growing. But there is growth, there is directionality. There's a lot going on in this region, but it simplifies and in a lot of ways obfuscates the true situation by saying this is one big urban megaregion. I think the growth around the Cincinnati-Dayton corridor up into Columbus, you see Cleveland growing the same way, so a lot of that is concentrated in Ohio, but Detroit looks to be growing northward as well, so a lot to dig in there. Same thing for the Piedmont Atlantic. This is the southeast. We really don't see a massive urbanized area emerging. There are very significant rural gaps in between urban areas, and this is one thing we can observe just looking at this. Atlanta is the big city that you can see there, and apologies for the no labels. It gets very cluttered when we put labels on, but sometimes I think it helps just looking at the image, and your brain recognizes patterns before you see a word and connect it to something else, so it forms questions in your mind a little better. That's kind of the intent behind the symbology here. Still very much a work in progress. And then the Southwest is particularly interesting for a few reasons. One, significant growth is occurring, but not at that pace that was expected, but also the sheer size of the county boundaries in the West, and especially in Southern California, is a challenge to an entire county-based methodology of doing anything. So I did this dozens of times, and San Bernardino County was always a problem for me because if you include it in your megaregion, you include this vast expansive desert in between LA and Las Vegas. But if you exclude it, you lose San Bernardino and some key elements of that urban area. So the only way to solve this problem is to move down a scale to census tracts where we can more accurately show the boundaries, but still pull that vital economic, population, census-based information. And same thing with Phoenix. I mean, just looking at the highway travel and traffic and the big desert expanses, connecting these three urban zones doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense using these inputs. And then finally ending off in the Northeast, where we're all probably most familiar with. This actually makes a lot of sense to me, with the exception of Hunterdon County. I wouldn't really call that a gap county, but again, the strength of committing to the quantitative methodology and accepting the fact that it's never going to be perfect, or maybe I'll find that there is a perfect methodology out there, but I doubt it. If I tweak something to eliminate Hunterdon County as a gap, maybe fill in Monmouth that got dropped as an urban megaregion but is still considered a growth county, it will break something somewhere else and create kind of an absurd regional definition elsewhere in the country. And that's what I think is actually most rewarding about doing work like this. Is you apply a formula, you realize that reality is far more complex, even the modeled reality that we work with in GIS, than you can simply put in a container. And simply saying, okay, well, we'll start quantitative and then we'll go qualitative and simply draw our boundaries, that kind of removes something from the process. So I think I have a lot more to learn about these particular areas and what's going on across the country just by going through this process and doing the research. So one last thing on this series of maps, because I just did it yesterday and it was pretty exciting. Automating the creation of maps in ArcGIS Pro, where you basically create one layout and say county name here, population here, whatever calculations, and then you run it on every single county in the country, and you've got a PDF map of all of them now with that information, with the name. And I had a lot of fun just looking through and trying to figure out where is this, but it's that level of analysis that we can apply again here in the Commonwealth, looking at investments, looking at what's going on. So I'll end off with kind of the direction that I'm taking my research, is to produce ultimately a map that represents the urban megaregions as kind of a synthesis of regions that were developed based on specific problems. I mean, that's ultimately the conclusion I arrived at, is if you're going to define regions, they're only meaningful if there's a problem or a question or something that you're doing it for. Generic regions don't make a whole lot of sense and really can't be defended from any kind of academic perspective. So this is what I'm working with, the gap and the growth counties, and trying to see the directionality of this stuff. This is the latest megaregional definition map, and there's even a textbook from 2022 using these regions as the urban megaregions of the United States, and using these counties to calculate all the statistics and the tables and the findings. And it's kind of moving in the opposite direction of what I found, right? I found that the population and employment growth is more concentrated, less than we expected. So these areas should be shrinking, not growing. But what we have is, once you have an established methodology, published work supporting it, it kind of grows from there. And at least my working hypothesis is that this approach is moving in the opposite direction of what we're observing in reality. And it's very much closer to this map that was produced by Philip Carney in 2021. You can check his work out at insightcartography.com. Feel terrible that I cut it off there on the slide, but it's .com. That used census tracts, contiguous high density, 100+ persons per square kilometer, and created this map that I think much more accurately reflects the real situation, where we have these concentrated zones, and then the majority of the space, the aerial territory of the Earth's surface in the lower 48, and also Alaska, Hawaii for that matter, are not heavily urbanized. And planners, geographers, anyone using these materials that look very authoritative really need to keep that in mind. So that's kind of my working assumption, is that geographers and planners typically publish in different ways. Geographers publish in peer-reviewed journals that very often focus on methodological rigor and go through a couple iterations, and you have something that's ideally defensible. Whereas, planners very often publish plans as part of work they're contracted to do, or in the case of RPA, develop their own publications and they publish their own work. So you have these regional planning associations, Lincoln Land Institute included, that self-publish, and which is fine in theory, but it's an interesting distinction where, I would say we can be a little more critical of methodologies adopted by non-peer-reviewed publications than the ones that are. But connecting those dots and actually producing something useful is the challenge. So the PA strategic plan is the next 10 years. The target date for that is 2033. We want to see leadership by these metrics in these industries across the Commonwealth. That's something we can map and track for the next 10 years. And then the whole RPA vision came from this America 2050 initiative that they had. So my plan is to basically do this every year for the next 25 years as part of my work as a geographer and see, okay, do the long-term assumptions add up? Or are we seeing things change in a major way, where a lot of assumptions about what the future is going to look like need to be revisited? And that's really the point, what I'm going to be up to for the foreseeable future. So that's all I've got for today. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Hey, any questions? Kara, I'll be right over there. Hold on, I'll have to run all the way over. Oh, okay. I'm already over there.
So I actually come from one of the growth counties that you indicated for our current region here. And one of the things that immediately stood out to me was that if it wasn't included in the original definition, it probably should be coming soon. And one of the things that immediately jumped out to me was that based on the county, I know that, well, I would guess that a lot of the growth comes from land use and zoning ordinances or a lack thereof. And I was curious if you were finding any correlation between growth versus not becoming some sort of opportunistic land grab for economic development, especially along major transportation corridors.
I mean, that's a great question. And probably, I'm not at that level of analysis yet. Those are all kind of assumptions in my mind. So that I'm working towards kind of getting an understanding of, is that a pattern across the board that I'm seeing in these growth counties? I would assume it most certainly would be. But that's more to come on that front.
All right, Justin had his hand up first. Eric, I'm making my way over.
Thanks, great presentation. I have two questions. Why are you using county boundaries as your lowest denominator? It seems kind of uneven.
It is uneven. It's been problematic. Simple answer is that's what the RPA did, and my first step was to recreate their methodology. So I chose the county and county equivalent as the grain to work with, but I want to work towards census tracts because that's a far less problematic geographic unit to work with this data.
Right. If urban megaregions have economic value, is there value and what's the value for a megaregion to have those rural hinterlands that aren't connecting?
So one of the really interesting things about the Northeast is there are lots of at least rural landscape areas, small farms, rolling countryside, areas that you wouldn't really picture as being urban, but are a key part of the framework. And that's a big part of that Megalopolis book, is explaining that, look, the local agriculture, the farms, the preserved area, the conserved area, the parks, all of this is largely a result of the urbanization and activity that's happening here. Not, there's a very big difference between the type of preserved and undeveloped rural, agricultural, recreational lands that exist within the urban megaregion than exist in the rural areas. So I think that if that's kind of the gist of the question, like what's the value of rural areas for an urban megaregion, I think within the megaregion, because the scale is large enough to accommodate massive undeveloped natural areas where people can exist at their scale and feel like, they're in nature. That's common across pretty much every single one of these megaregions. But it's different from a rural landscape in that those are very often very valuable tracts of land that have been preserved by the very institutions, people, organizations, societies that exist within the urban sphere. So that's one of the things I'm looking at is there's different types of rural, and there's a specifically urban megaregion type of rural that I think we can define, and it'll be hopefully enlightening to review that across the country.
I'm not sure how to frame the question, but it relates to geographic regions, and do those transportation corridors eliminate geographic constraints or accentuate them? Did you think about that in your
Oh, absolutely, yeah,
regional
because
nomination?
the whole transportation problem in defining megaregions, if you look closely into the Regional Plan Association, you realize that high-speed passenger rail is a predominant focus. And if you look at that map of megaregions they published in 2009, they line up very well with all of the proposed high-speed passenger rail lines. So the whole idea is these megaregions bring problems of transportation, which is why we need planning at this scale to get multiple states, multiple different stakeholders, everyone working together to solve these problems. One great quick example, a student from Westchester a couple years ago published his master's thesis on the I-95 corridor through Philadelphia and taking a look at if the 95 highway hadn't been built over all these neighborhoods, what would be the total tax revenue that the city would have gotten from all of those displaced businesses and residents? But what we can do is look at the research that he provided and then look at the mega regional scale and say, okay, what's the trade-off? Because we have a mega regional transportation need to move people and goods up and down the Northeast corridor that might not have anything to do with the local economy of Philadelphia, but there's an inherent conflict there. So that's really what the research is intended to look into. What do the transportation constraint regions look like? And is that the bottleneck that now we can all focus in on, rally around, make a policy proposition like, look, it's a transportation bottleneck that's holding things up. We've got to solve it here or else nothing else can happen. That's kind of the point, is to get to that point.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Hi, great presentation. So you mentioned light pollution as one of the parameters. How did you operationalize that in a quantitative way? I know there's some research out there that does this to measure economic activities. And then I'm a sociologist by training, so I'm curious, you mentioned the culture as something that sort of like a imagined community sort of aspect of a mega region. Do you plan on incorporating that? And if so, have you, in what way do you expect to incorporate that into your categorization?
Absolutely. Remind me of the first question, sorry.
Oh, so light pollution.
Light pollution, yeah. So I'll, very quickly, it's a very simple analysis that I did where I took the raster layer, the geotiff from NASA, did a raster calculation. Everything with the high blue value gets a 1, everything else is 0, and then I turned that raster into a polygon and then take a look at select by location who's got a 100 kilometer or larger light pollution area within it. And then in terms of culture, that's one of the most difficult aspects of this, and I think it's a reason that contemporary geographers have strayed away from regional geography, because it is very subjective and potentially very reinforcing of what's currently existing in terms of any kind of power dynamics or social relations. So I'm advocating for less non-transparent qualitative definitions, and I think very often the cultural aspect falls in that qualitative arena. So it's not an area of focus immediately, but definitely something, as I mature this, something that I'm open for collaboration with people who actually have expertise in those areas.
All right, great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.